Hi everyone, welcome to the Marion Minor Cook Athenaeum. My name is Miriam Farah and I'm one of your Athenaeum Fellows for the school year. Every year, thousands of families cross the US-Mexico border, especially women and their children who are seeking international asylum and protection. During these dangerous journeys, women face high rates of physical and sexual violence. Trauma from this type of gender-based violence is exacerbated by women's experiences in carceral institutions by the border. At these detention centers, many immigrants have reported several violations, including abuse, overpopulation, and inadequate services. Oftentimes, the US government has also forcibly separated these families, which creates additional long-term trauma for parents and children. Tonight, we will hear from Dr. Elizabeth Farfán-Santos, who will discuss more about the immigrant experience, especially for mothers and their children crossing the southern border. She's the author of 2 books, and tonight she will talk about her newest one, titled Undocumented Motherhood, Conversation on Love, Trauma, and Border Crossing, which is a hybrid ethnography, memoir, and testimonial. In this book, Dr. Farfán-Santos follows the story of Claudia Garcia, who crossed the US-Mexico border for her daughter Natalia, who cannot hear. Her book reveals how both the education and medical systems in the US enforce undocumented status, perpetuate disability, and shape the experiences of motherhood for many undocumented Mexican women. Her book partly stems from her background of being a Chicana author and a medical anthropologist who grew up in a Mexican immigrant and working class household led by women. While she is not writing, Dr. Farfán-Santos teaches about race, gender, ethnicity in biomedicine, as well as barriers to healthcare access at the University of Houston's medical school. Dr. Farfán-Santos is also deeply connected with her community in Houston. To improve public health there, she has worked with leaders at the Houston Harris Health System and has also led sessions on cultural humility for researchers at the UT Health Science Center of Houston. Her research, her writings, and her lectures all take an intersectional approach by considering an individual's backgrounds in their experiences in healthcare and immigration. Before getting started tonight, I would like to remind you all to please silence your phones and please remember that both video and audio recordings are strictly prohibited. Now please join me in welcoming Dr. Farfán-Santos.
Hello everyone, good evening. Thank you everyone for being here. I know that you all probably have a dozen places that you can be, so I really appreciate you being here. And I'm also very thankful to be invited. Thank you to the students for engaging my work, for reading my work, for finding the courage and the space to say we want her to come out here. Thank you so much. You guys have some really incredible students out here. I love students in general. I think you're all brilliant, but really, you guys have engaged me in some really exciting conversations. I'm really proud of all of y'all. Thank you so much for having me here. All right, I'm gonna start by reading a short passage from the book, and then I'll kind of go through a little bit about where the work comes from and some of the aspects of the work that I think are most exciting and most interesting for me. This is from a chapter called What Sickness? Right now, I am sick. I have a sickness que ya no se quita. It's a sickness in my bones. I get sudden pains in my joints. Some days it's worse than others, but the pain is always there. Despite that, I still get up at 5 in the morning and make lunch for my daughters, bathe them and take them to school, everything. A lot of times I just have to do it all like that, with pain and everything. And my mind, for example, has to say, ¿Cuál enfermedad? What sickness? Because I have obligations. It was a new day. Claudia and I, sorry, that's not where it's going. The sickness in my bones is, it's called fibromyalgia, I asked. Yes, something like that. They just discovered I had it like 5 months ago. I went to the doctor because I didn't feel well. I felt really bad. I would get a lot of fevers and I had so much pain in my bones. I would get chills and I just couldn't stand it. My head would hurt so bad. I would get hit with a pain here, and then this whole side of my body would hurt. Pues sí, me sentía muy mal. I had been feeling that way for a long time. So one day I just said, no, no more. I was driving and the headache hit me and I felt dizzy, like I wanted to vomit and pass out. So that was when I went to the doctor. And I told him everything I was feeling. The doctor gave me some medicine, and at first it helped control the pain, and I thought, okay, now I will feel better. But with my body just wouldn't receive the treatments. According to the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, common symptoms of fibromyalgia are pain and stiffness all over the body, headaches and migraines, fatigue, tingling or numbness, digestive issues, depression, and anxiety. Claudia recalled that she had been diagnosed with fibromyalgia only a few months before our conversation. It made me wonder how long she may have been dealing with the symptoms, how long she'd gone undiagnosed, and how fibromyalgia may have affected her mothering in the months after she arrived in the United States. As I did more research on the illness, I read that there weren't really any definitive answers as to what might cause fibromyalgia, but there are some theories and associations. Most of the publications I read concluded that symptoms of fibromyalgia often begin after a traumatic physical or psychological experience, and women are more likely to develop it. I thought back to Claudia's migration story, the desperation she felt to leave, fleeing everything and everyone she knew, the multiple failed attempts to cross the river, the fear of drowning, and all the times she had to say goodbye to Nati and leave her with coyotes, the fear of what might happen and of possibly never seeing her daughter again, the guilt of putting her in the care of strangers. I thought about how Claudia's body was shoved into the roof fairing of an 18-wheeler truck, the terror she felt when she was caught and left in the desert with a strange man, and then threatened with death and rape by the people who were supposed to get her safely across the border. I thought about her being caught by immigration and thrown in a detention center, the fear of being erased, of having no way to contact her family and call for help, the extreme cold and the humiliation, not having the privacy to fulfill basic human needs such as using the bathroom. Even after all that, she kept trying to cross. She had to, for Nati. I thought about how Claudia was stuffed inside of another truck with dozens of other people she didn't know, mostly men, crammed in like sardines, how she had to listen to a woman being raped and wait in horror to see if she would be next, how she had to try as hard as she could to be quiet and invisible so she wouldn't be caught by immigration and so she wouldn't stand out to the men. I thought about her walking across the border, the desert in the middle of the night, stepping over cadavers and snakes, terrified of lagging and getting separated from the group, her feet destroyed, bleeding and blistered, exhausted and barely able to walk. Yes, I thought to myself, that sounds like a pretty traumatic physical and psychological experience, or rather experiences, multiple, repeated, concentrated. The body records trauma. The collateral damage of migration, the shock, was forever carved into Claudia's body. I think about how it would feel to have anything carved into my body. Of course, it would hurt, but would the pain linger and vibrate for days, years? Would I feel the pain deep in my bones, in the joints, the parts of my body that stitch me together and make me whole? Would I get migraines and get so overwhelmed by the pain that I would fall into deep despair, into depression? I don't think Claudia made the connection between her fibromyalgia symptoms and her migration. When I asked her if she had ever thought about it, she seemed surprised at first, then pensive, like maybe it made sense. Pero quién sabe, verdad? She asked, as though a connection had been made, but it was all too much to think about. Another word for trauma can be susto. My grandmother took susto very seriously. She taught me that when you experience a traumatic event, your spirit is jolted out of your body, frightened away, leaving you disoriented and vulnerable. If you don't take care to recover your frightened spirit, your body remains defenseless, open, and more susceptible to additional harm, including illness. Over and over, Claudia referred to her migration story as horrible, muy feo. I think she understood that it was a traumatizing experience, but from what she shared with me, she hadn't named the trauma, the susto, or taken the time to begin healing her spirit, to call it back to her body. Claudia couldn't really say how long she'd experienced the symptoms of fibromyalgia, but she was sure it started after she migrated to the United States. I thought about her revelation of feeling overwhelmed and hopeless as Nati's mother and sole caregiver. Seemingly disparate parts of her story were beginning to connect. The physical body of trauma was forming like a puzzle, coming into view with each intangible piece. For years, Claudia had been suffering with the symptoms of fibromyalgia, feeling chronic and invasive pain all over her body, while also fighting with doctors to obtain care for her daughter. Worrying about how she would pay for everything and being tortured by migraines, nausea, and dizziness. But despite everything, she was also learning how to mother a strong and independent daughter with a hearing disability, and learning how to adapt to and align with all the demands of a North American life, including learning English and American Sign Language, teaching her daughter both of those as well as Spanish, dealing with teachers and physicians who questioned her motherhood because of the language she spoke or didn't speak, while also being undocumented and feeling burdened by the numerous barriers and threats she faced just driving her children to the doctor. To say that she was dealing with a lot is an understatement. It's more than most of us could handle. It's enough to make the physical body crash and scream for help. Fibromyalgia was Claudia's body screaming for help, begging her to stop and heal, begging someone to help her stop and heal. Fibromyalgia literally knocked Claudia off her feet. It made it impossible for her to do anything, even walk. It made her, for the first time, demand that her husband help her. Illness is the body communicating to us and everyone around us that something is wrong and we need to listen. Sometimes the body whispers, but other times it shouts. Because everything else is noisy and demanding, the body must be louder, especially for women. It makes sense to me, given all the demands and pressures on women and mothers, that women are more likely to get an illness characterized by chronic, generalized pain all over the body. It makes sense, given how uncompromising the demands on women are, that women would be more likely to get an illness that makes their bodies cry in pain and shut down in protest. I wonder how many undocumented immigrant women might be suffering from undiagnosed fibromyalgia, how many might suffer from depression and anxiety caused by fibromyalgia. Biomedicine doesn't know the exact cause of the disease because there isn't just one cause located in the material body. It can't be dissected out of a person and biopsied. It doesn't fit under a microscope or in a test tube. We may never know how many undocumented Latinas suffer from fibromyalgia or other stress-induced illnesses, from the strain and complexity of an undocumented life, compounded by gendered demands, chronic pain, and the stigma of an invisible illness screaming but unheard. Thank you. So the book, as you kind of gather from that excerpt, focuses on one undocumented mother whose name in the story is Claudia and her daughter, Nati, or Natalia. The research leading up to the book, so I was doing research for several years on undocumented immigrants and their experiences with the healthcare system, particularly in Texas. The research really started around the time of the Affordable Care Act and healthcare reforms under the Obama administration. It was really interesting to me as somebody who grew up in an immigrant family. I had undocumented members, family members in my family. My father was undocumented. I write about him a little bit in the book, and other members of my family. But also we depended on the public health system. And so we grew up on Medicaid and WIC and CHIP and these kinds of programs. They were really important to our family, in fact. And my mom talks about how without them, she doesn't know what she would have done. And we had access to them because we were citizens. Undocumented immigrants don't have access to those programs. So we had in our generation, my generation certainly, in my generation, certainly in many of yours, we haven't seen a healthcare reform ever in our lifetimes. So the healthcare reforms around the Affordable Care Act were really important and really fascinating to me once they started to happen. More fascinating even was the language of human rights and justice that was being used by the Obama administration to kind of promote those reforms. And so it was very much about healthcare for all, healthy futures for all, and we were all kind of on our toes about what it was going to look like. It ended up not being the full universal care that I had hoped that it would be. But what was most interesting during that time was the very intentional and very vocal exclusion of undocumented immigrants throughout the healthcare reforms. And I say very intentional and very vocal because I did see it, and I do see it, it was a symbolic act. So undocumented immigrants have not had access to public health resources or any kinds of government programs since the 90s. So, I mean, they've never really had access. So the inaccess that they would have experienced during the Affordable Care Act wouldn't have changed very much for these communities. And yet it was still important to point out that they were not included, primarily as a way of defining citizenship, right? Of creating that separation between the person who is documented and those who are undocumented, and what makes, what makes us special as citizens, right? Because in reality, nobody in the United States has the human right to health care. It is privatized, and so you have access to it through your health insurance. We don't have the right to health care, and so that unites us in that way, right? But if there is this massive group of people that we are fundamentally or it feels like we have more than, right, then we rally behind that, right? And that's kind of creates a sense of belonging for our national identity, right, in opposition to a marginalized group. So I was interested in understanding what that exclusion was, how that exclusion was experienced by communities. And when I went into the clinics, this is kind of what I was going to ask. And it ended up that when I was in the clinics, I ended up meeting primarily mothers and children. These were the people that were in the clinics, primarily taking their children to the doctor. And so the work ended up being about mothers because that's who was interacting with the healthcare system on a regular basis. And when I started interviewing mothers, in the beginning, I wanted to talk about the policy, and I wanted to talk about exclusion and how they felt, and did they feel marginalized? I had these very big questions, and they wanted to talk about their children. They wanted to talk about their children's access. They had copious, notes and stories about their interactions with the healthcare system and how they interacted with these systems on a daily basis. And that's what I ended up recording. So ultimately, the research really changed to focus on mothers and their experiences, because that's what people wanted to talk about. So for several years, I talked to several mothers and kind of documented their stories and their experiences with the system. When I met Claudia, she was different in the sense that she was charismatic, and she wanted to talk a lot. She wanted to tell me about her life. She wanted to share the various aspects and layers of her experience. And she was very much open to that. Not everybody, when you go out there and do research, not everybody wants to talk to you. Not everybody's a talker, so it was very rare, right, that she wanted to share more of her story. And when I asked her if she would be willing to do more interviews for the book, she was very open to that. That initial research that I did on health and immigration, I've published several papers, and that work is specifically, in the language that I write in, is specifically geared towards public health leaders, people who are working in the public health realm. And the idea is really to try to improve interactions and services on the ground level for undocumented immigrants and undocumented immigrant communities, by kind of helping folks understand, one, who's interacting with the system. There's a really powerful narrative and discourse around immigrants and healthcare, that kind of paints them as not only bad patients, in the sense that they aren't kind of doing what their doctor is telling them to do, but also people who aren't going to the doctor, or aren't going soon enough, aren't taking care of their health, and sort of responsible in some way for the kind of chronic illnesses that have, that their identities are attached to, right? So things like heart disease and diabetes, right? So we hear from these communities. And the research shows otherwise, right? The research shows that folks are in fact interacting with the system, and especially women are interacting a lot with the system, and they are, in doing so, they are really, they're being incredibly brave, because they're interacting with structures where they're being required to be incredibly visible, and to share a lot of very vulnerable and personal information. And so you're thinking about, the label of being undocumented, you're talking about people who are actually really very documented within public health systems and structures, right? And so, you think about address, phone number, everyday activities within the family, who's in the family, and all of these things, women are exposing themselves in these ways to make sure that their children are healthy and are getting the care that they need. And specifically, what I argue in my work, in many ways, they're protecting and creating a future, right, for their families, because that's what children are. They're the future. And so to be able to imagine, to be able to plan and think about a child's health is really to sustain and, in the case of undocumented immigrants, to create a future for communities, for families and thus communities. So the work, so that work kind of has that objective. But there was also, you know, when you're talking about motherhood and when you're talking about, and particularly I was talking about trauma and I was talking about maternal love, and that it has very emotive. There's a vulnerability there. There's a softness. There is another layer of experience, right? That is not just kind of that policy and kind of you know, that structural, rhetorical kind of discourse, which I think is also important. And there is some of that in the book, but I wanted to also have a space where I talked about the emotive experience, the emotional experience that I was seeing, right? And how women were reacting outside of just what they were saying, what they were expressing, the tears, the anger, the frustration, the feelings that were coming out in those interviews. So the book then was going to focus on that and really focus on the undocumented immigrant as a whole human, as a human being, and attempt to engage the reader in the human experience and make that kind of human connection. So the book primarily focuses on one person, on one immigrant woman and her daughter, and, you know, kind of go through her experience. But as I was interviewing her, and then later on when I was reflecting on the interviews and thinking about how to put the book together, you know, it was impossible for me not to reflect on my own maternal experiences and the women in my life, namely my mother and my grandmother, who were the women that raised me. But also, as Marian said, I was raised in a household of women, and so I was also raised by my aunts, and there were, in general, my household was led by women. So I kept going back. I kept having these kind of flashes of memory. Particularly, one thing that I write about in the book is, you know, when we were very young, because my dad had been undocumented and my parents were both very young, they were teenage parents, and, you know, weren't able to finish their education because they both had to work to support their families. We didn't have a lot of money, and when my mom when we were born, they couldn't pay for daycare. There wasn't a way to kind of take care of us and work to support the household. We were homeless for a while, until, you know, my grandmother comes and she says, "Let me take them with me to Mexico. I'll take care of them so you can work." And this is an experience that a lot of Latinx families have. A lot of Mexican children of immigrant families have this experience of going across the border to spend time with their family members, and particularly their grandmother. And I lived with my grandmother for several years. And this is a part of my life that I see as a title case, that I used to see as a title case chapter in my life, and that I held very fondly. But it wasn't until I started listening to Claudia and hearing her talk about her experience, particularly the times where she had to separate from Natalia on the border, where she handed Natalia over to coyotes, and she wasn't with her, the grief, the despair, the shame that she felt for some of the decisions that she had to make, imagining what could have happened, imagining what Nati might think when she gets older, and really feeling that despair for those decisions, that it clicked, you know. I've never asked my own mother how she felt about being separated from us when we were young. I always just saw it as, oh, that was the time that I lived with my grandmother, and it was great. As I got older, I also had developed some sadness and some resentment with my mother because we were apart, and we were apart at very critical ages, at a very critical age, and it affected our relationship. And so when, you know, I was forced to look at Claudia and think of her as a full human, as a woman who was making decisions, the best decisions that she could make, with very few good options. It also forced me to think about my mother as a woman herself, and the experiences and the decisions that she had to make, and what that may have felt like for her. And so I also decided to interview her and get to know, what was she feeling? What was that experience like for her? So my mother's story comes into the book as well, and a little bit of my grandmother. Although I wasn't able, I had intended to interview my grandmother, and unfortunately she passed during the beginning of the pandemic. So I wasn't able to get back to her. Now I'll get emotional about it. But she's in the book, her spirit is in the book. So, it's actually great that I'm a little bit crying because, the vulnerability is such a big part of this book for me. And not just because of the real emotions that came out. So there were many moments in the book, in the writing, where I had to stop. It was very heavy to write, not just Claudia's story, but also what it was recalling in my life. And there were so many times where I would just cry, I would reread it and I would cry, and then I would have to come back to it. And I wanted that to be a part of it. So I'm an anthropologist by training, which is technically a science. At least we like to see ourselves as scientists. Thank you. And, we are very, we try to stick to it, right? And so we want to see ourselves as these objective observers, who kind of go out there and we document these stories and we write about them through an objective lens, right? And we kind of give you, the story as it is on the ground. And that's not true. So, we aren't objective, we aren't objects of science, we aren't tools, we are human beings. And we have, we bring all of our baggage and our perspective to our work, even from the moment we decide on a question, which is why I gave you a little bit of the background of how I came to to study these topics. And so I wanted to, I wanted to be true to what was coming out, how I was processing the story and the connections that I was making to Claudia. Because ultimately, that's what I wanted the reader to do. I wanted the reader to connect to Claudia at the level of humanity, at the level of human experience, at the level of emotion. I wanted the reader to feel stuff, and the only way to do that was to model it, right? You can't really, I guess maybe you can fake it, I don't know. There's some really great fiction writers out there that make us feel stuff. But, it really, you kind of have to participate in it. But also as a matter of ethic, I think that when you are going to ask a person to be so vulnerable, particularly when it has to do with the decisions that you make as a mother, I think you have to be willing to make yourself vulnerable as well. And particularly with the undocumented immigrant, one of the narratives that I'm trying to push up against is this objectification of the immigrant, this dehumanization of the immigrant that we hear in the media. These are folks that have been turned into caricatures of themselves. They've been turned into objects of political discourse, and that's it. Right? Their identities have been completely flattened, right? So where we see them as, a border crisis, we see them as an illegal, as an alien, as everything except all of the layered aspects of who they are as human beings. And not only are they immigrants, right, but they are also, they don't stop being mothers and brothers and sisters and daughters and all of these other things. So just because you're undocumented doesn't mean that you're no longer experiencing all of the trials and tribulations of motherhood and everything else that comes with it. And so part of being vulnerable and sharing vulnerability, creating a space of vulnerability and sharing that space with Claudia is also kind of putting myself within that gaze and creating a safe, almost like a community space for Claudia's narrative in the book. With my story, with my mother's story, so she's kind of supported, right? There are other women that are supporting her story. And in that way, hopefully the book is less extractive, right? And objectifying, right, of this one woman's story. And so that's also part of why I speak so much about vulnerability in the book, but also I use the concept of testimonio, which is kind of a Latin American way of thinking about witnessing. And it comes out of Latin America, particularly because of the history of violence and dictatorships and politics of Latin America. This idea of the testimonio and to witness really is a way of thinking about kind of listening, but also being a part of and being responsible to, right? And so, you know, when I talk about the book, I talk about it as an ethnography, but also a memoir in a way, and testimonio, right? Where there are moments where I ask the reader to kind of pause, where I describe something or I share something that's particularly difficult, or where there's something that I know that's already going to get the reader to kind of reduce, oh, I know what this is, and kind of reduce it into this little theoretical box, and I say, let's take a breath, pause, you know, let's stop. And there's a lot of moments like that in the book, so that, you know, I am also kind of contesting the kind of the theoretical impulse, right, when it comes to topics like this, to automatically kind of reduce, right, because that also objectifies. And so as I read this excerpt from chapter 3, What's Sickness, I talk a lot about trauma. And, you know, so there's, at the beginning of the book, there's the experience of the migration. It's very traumatic, it's very difficult, but the whole book isn't like that. And it's really important that there is for me, that there is a balance in how I'm telling this story. Again, you know, when we talk about certain communities, particularly marginalized communities, alienated communities, racialized communities, but also gender minorities, it often gets reduced to trauma. It often gets reduced to the violence and the suffering. And that's all we hear, and particularly in the field of public health, right? It's all about exclusion, it's all about vulnerability, and it's not to say that that's not important, that that doesn't exist, and that we don't need to write about that. But also, all of our lives are not just suffering and trauma, right? There is so much more. There is healing, and there is joy, and there is community, and there is life, or else these communities wouldn't have survived so many generations of violent exclusion, right, and targeting. And so I want to balance, those things kind of get balanced in the book, really, again, to kind of try to stay true to the human experience. Joy and suffering are always intertwined. There's never just one. Even though we may feel the suffering more, there is always joy. They're always in there. So there are moments of humor, there are moments of laughter in the book. But the trauma, I think, and also when I write about the trauma, this is kind of the medical anthropology aspect of it, where I'm thinking, you know, I'm looking at the stories as these experiences, the cultural dynamics of Claudia's experience, but also connecting it back to the physical body. And I'm making these connections as I'm hearing her story. I'm automatically thinking about how these things might be affecting her physically, and coming out somatically in ways that she may never have thought of, right? Because we're not. I mean, it's interesting because when you're talking about Mexican women, and, you know, having grown up in a household with very strong Mexican women, these are women who, you know, they get written about in a way that is so disconnected from how you see them when you're living with them. You know, they're just strong, and they're just doing everything, and they're not complaining, and they're certainly not letting you complain. And, you know, my grandmother used to say, you don't drown in a glass of water, right? Whatever happens, you pick yourself up and you keep going, right? I mean, that's just what it is. Weakness was not something that you ever wanted to, you know, look like, you know, or show, right? It was strength is valued. You know, the strong, able body is very much valued. You're talking about communities that work with their bodies and their hands for the most part. And so it's very important, and we're talking about women and mothers who are taking care of families and leading households. And so these are people that are experiencing things, but that are experiencing pain sometimes, and don't say anything about it until they collapse, you know? And so Claudia collapsed. And that was when she went to the doctor. And I tell a story about my mom, who was dealing with uterine fibroids, and she was bleeding a lot, and she was just kind of letting it go. And, you know, she got to the point where she fainted while she was swimming, and finally went to the doctor. And the doctor said her anemia was so bad. The doctor said, I don't even know how you're alive right now. You could have had a heart attack at any moment. She could have collapsed at any moment. you know, and she didn't know that she felt weak all the time. She felt all the things that anemia makes you feel. And she just thought that that was normal because she worked so much. And so she tells me, she worked, I don't even know how many jobs. She worked like 3 jobs or something. She was taking care of a family. She just thought it was normal that she was always tired, right? And so, you know, I talk about how this narrative and this, you know, particular experience of Mexican motherhood, of strength and what strength looks like. And I think it's important because, you know, when you're only talking about the Mexican immigrant, the book specifically focuses on Mexican immigrants, when you're only looking at this group of people as this political object, and there's all of these other layers of their experiences that you're not talking about, you don't know about, right? Because they're not coming from the perspective of people who have lived these experiences, then you will never even guess that there is this experience of a strong Mexican mother, because that's not what we hear about. And if you don't get to that, then you can't get to the other stuff. You can't get to the fibromyalgia, and you can't get to the stress-induced illnesses, because you haven't gotten to that part first, right? There's no concept of a strong Mexican mother, right? For the other stuff to come out. So we have to be able to see the layers of identity so that we can get to some of this other stuff, right? And so yes, strength and resilience is an incredible aspect of the community, and I write about how, you know, that has been an aspect of the survival of these communities. But then I also want to write about what that has done to the health of women and mothers, and how women have, you know, now kind of really sacrificed their bodies for their communities, and now are experiencing all of these other things. And, you know, there isn't a lot of focus on it, right? There isn't a lot of care or attention to it. You know, back in February, I was presenting this at the College of Medicine, and there was a woman afterwards who came up to me and said, you know, I want you to write a book just about this, because I don't think that people really get it. I don't think people really get the weight of what it is to have to be strong. I don't think people understand, and all of the different guilt tactics that exist in kind of keeping you in that space. And she was so passionate about that, because she had kind of, you know, she was kind of in a moment of awakening, you know, and learning to heal herself from some of this stuff herself. But it's so ingrained in the fabric of what it means to belong to a community. You know, it's very much a part of a person's identity, and feeling needed, feeling important, feeling valued, which brings me to another aspect of the book, which is some of these underlying kind of human universals. In anthropology, we have a few human universals, and I mean, one of them certainly is belonging. We don't talk enough about how fundamental belonging is to survival. We are, you know, despite what you may have heard, you know, we are not individuals living on an island. We actually need each other very much. We are interconnected, and we absolutely have to feel a sense of belonging. Otherwise, we have things that happen when that isn't there, and it's not good. So, you know, there are certain aspects of the human experience that come out of these stories that we can connect to, because we're mothers, and we may have, you know, I was telling the students earlier, you know, to have a child with 102-degree temperature at 11 o'clock at night or midnight on a Sunday, you know, and not know what to do, or not have a doctor that you can call, you know, that feeling, you know, for those of you that are parents, you know exactly what that feeling is. And it doesn't matter if you're undocumented or not, you know what that feeling is, right? And so there are these emotions that come out that we can connect to at different levels of our experience, right? That we can understand because we're human and we've experienced them different ways, right? So we get, and particularly when it has to do with some of these topics of the way that women, and as I read in this excerpt, kind of the weight of expectations on the shoulders of women in this society, and you know, the way that women's health is treated in the medical system,
Historically, women's pain has been largely neglected within medical structures, and that's something that is just starting to change. Education about women's body, understanding our bodies outside of just reproductive health, all of the kind of the aspects of the woman's body. These are things that we're not traditionally taught, and there's very little knowledge of in medical literature, because medical history is primarily based on the male body, right? Because for generations that was considered, it doesn't really matter, right? At the end of the day, they're all organs and the body is all the same, and it's just doesn't matter, right? You got one of those Mr. Stretch, those Mr. Stretch guys, it doesn't matter, they're all the same. And now we're recognizing that, no, oh yeah, it does matter. There's some differences there. And so I think that there are different ways that we can connect to these experiences regardless of our immigration status. And that's really important. So as I said, there are spaces of healing and pause in the book. The Comadres chapter is one of my favorites because it's where I talk about comadrazgo. And it takes a whole chapter to try to define comadrazgo, and I probably still didn't define it in the way that everybody would define it. And so you're going to have to go read it, right, to really get the gist of it. But basically, comadres, we could even translate as co-mothers, are friends, they're mothers, they're best friends. It's a relationship that sometimes mirrors the maternal relationship, because these are people who take care of each other, that are trusted, and that in that relationship you feel the same kind of concern and desire to care for that friend of yours that you would a child. And they're female friendships, and it's Claudia's comadres that really kind of help her in so many different aspects of her life, particularly Beatriz, who is in this picture, and because Beatriz has had a child with a disability who she lost, and so she was very sensitive to Claudia's experience with Nati, and so she advocated for her. She spoke more English. She's a resident, and so she would help her navigate doctors and particularly navigate the school system. But she was also a big emotional support. And these are relationships that are unlike relationships with one's husband or partner. They're just very unique in themselves, and very much a way that women heal, just in conversation and dialogue and discourse. I bring in a little bit of literature on, there's some really interesting research on discussions between comadres, and things like chisme and kind of, how do you say chisme? Gossip, yes, gossiping. It's the chisme and the cafecito and some concha, and just sitting down with your comadres and no te cuento, right? And it's what kind of keeps us, it's medicine, okay, it's medicine. And so there are these, spaces kind of to bring the reader back, and there's reprieve, right, in there. And also, it in a way that's not directly stating it, but it speaks back to this, this discourse, and particularly in public health, that is very much resource deficient, that communities kind of, again, are just kind of needy and vulnerable, and that there are no resources that are kind of, native or that come from the community themselves, right? And certainly there are many. And then finally, the book is very much future. It has a perspective towards the future and thinking about the future. And this is very important to my work. It's really important to me that we're not just thinking about, that we're not just overwhelmed with the problems, but that we are highlighting hope and thinking about the future and how things are changing or might change. Obviously, Natalia is a young girl, and there is no better representation of hope in the future than children and youth. And there's so much about what Claudia is thinking about Nati. She's imagining what Nati's life might be like in the future. I mean, this is the whole reason for the struggle, for being here to try to get her a future. Claudia is from a really small town in Mexico where there weren't a lot of resources for somebody with a hearing impairment. They had never seen anybody who was a successful adult who had that kind of, who had a hearing impairment. And so for her, you know, even if she would say, even if she's just like a little assistant, you know, it's already better. And so I think about how she specifically says, you know, something chiquito, algo chiquito, you know, like a little assistant, you know, and that's such a big thing for her. And I think, why wouldn't she imagine something bigger? And then, you know, the perspective is on, well, everything is new, right? These are people that are creating a future out of thin air where it isn't supposed to exist. They're not even supposed to be here. They're not supposed to exist, right? These are impossible realities, right, that are happening. And so people are designing a future that what can be imagined is what's happening in the now. And there's an incredible focus on the present, on staying present, and on, you know, surviving and making sure that the things that need to be done are done. And so, you know, I kind of take the liberty then to imagine further for Nati, right, and think about what Nati might be. And I take, you know, memories of my students and think about some of my students that I've had in the past to kind of build and in the end I say, I don't know what Nati's future is going to be like. I don't know what she's going to remember of this experience, what it's going to be like for her. But ultimately, you know, that's going to be up to her. And it allows, I think, it allows the reader to, and you know, purposely, I didn't want the book to feel like it was ending, you know, like this is the end, this is, you know, I wanted to make sure that we understood that these are people who are alive and whose lives are going to are changing, and they're going to keep going. And just like we have no idea what we're going to do in the next 5 years, you know, we also, you know, I also can't say, I have no authority to say what Claudia and her family are going to do, right? And so to maintain that open, but also to model for the reader what a future, a focused perspective might look like, or a future thinking perspective. And so that kind of, that's the way the book sort of ends, if you will. So the last thing I'll talk about is are the blind contour drawings that you see throughout the book and that I've kind of shown throughout. These are drawings that I did myself from photographs of Claudia and her family. And blind contour is, and I write a little bit about what it is. A blind contour basically is an exercise in perspective. They're not supposed to be perfect. The idea of it is that you stare at a picture or a person, and then you draw that person using a single line without ever looking down at the paper. Okay? And so when you could do, it's really fun. You could do this, you know, over and over again. It isn't about what it looks like. It's not about artistic skills. It's about looking. It's about perspective. It's about seeing. And it's really interesting because when you're drawing the person, you know, you're so focused on the details. You're looking at everything and you're trying to get it. And then you look down at the paper and it's a complete abstraction. To put it nicely, you know, this was one of the more interesting ones that I did. And I did so many, but some of them came out better, like this one I was pretty proud of, especially with 2 people. And so this is kind of another layer of how I bring in this discussion of, you know, subjectivity versus objectivity, but also how our stories are intertwined, how we are interconnected with each other. And so, you know, very much the way that I am writing about Claudia has more to do with my perspective than her authentic experience, right? This isn't an authentic representation of her experience. This is my perspective of her experience, and, you know, how it intertwines and connects with mine. And I could sit down, just as I could draw this again and it'd be completely different. I could sit down and write the book today again and it would be completely different. You know, Claudia has changed. She's no longer the same person that she was when I interviewed her. I am no longer the same person that I was when I wrote this. You know, we keep changing and evolving. That is also an essential aspect of what it means to be human, that we're always changing and transforming. We never stay the same. However, when it comes to these marginalized communities and racialized communities, they do often get portrayed not only as a monolith, but as an unchanging object. They're always the same, right? And this complexity of their experiences, this capacity to change, to be multi-layered, to be contradictory, to be multiple things, to be one thing one day, another thing the other day, another day, you know, it doesn't get factored into their experience because they've been so dehumanized and objectified. So this is kind of another way of kind of bringing that in, that is more visual and kind of visually enticing for the reader. So that's kind of a little bit of the book. I feel like I've spoken a lot. I'll take some questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor, for that really wonderful talk. As she mentioned, she will now be taking questions. So please line up at one of these 2 microphones, and before you ask your question, briefly introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Annalise. I'm a junior here at CMC. And I just want to say thank you for coming. Your book and like just everything you've talked about resonates with me as someone who's from Houston and has had a lot of experience with the public health system there. Like my mom, like I was born at a private hospital due to an emergency, and emergency Medicaid came in clutch, I guess. And then like throughout the years, I've gone to the doctors with my mom. She has diabetes. So we've gone to a lot of the public health clinics in Houston. And I guess like also knowing that it's like a leading like medical center in the country, I was just wondering if you knew kind of where do you see like this like the discrepancies between like the public health system in Houston and then like the health like medical center, like will they ever meet when it comes to like the kind of care that they provide, because I know they like provide different cares for like different people in the city. So I was just wondering.
Yes, thank you. That's a great question. There definitely is, I think, a discrepancy when you're talking about, you have people from all over the world that come to the Texas Medical Center, the Houston Medical Center, and it is known worldwide. And so, the fact that you have a group of people that is excluded specifically because of their immigration status, that obviously is a discrepancy. That being said, one of the things that has, and I was talking with students about this earlier, when you're talking about participating in the healthcare system, again, because none of us has the right to health care. If you don't have insurance, if you're uninsured, you share a lot of the similar experiences as undocumented. So the documented immigrant participates in the healthcare system as an uninsured patient, right? That's pretty much their label. For the most part, people aren't, healthcare professionals are not asking them their immigration status, right? They're interacting with the system as an uninsured patient. So they have access, there are clinics, some of the clinics that I did research on where, they are being treated really well. I mean, there's actually some community clinics that have community health workers, particularly have community health workers that are doing amazing work in helping, educate the communities primarily in how to interact with the healthcare system. I mean, that's the other thing, is that in the United States, it really requires a Ph.D. in learning how to interact with the healthcare system. What is a copayment? What is a deductible? Who am I calling? What are the, who do I need to call first, right? There are all of these different steps, right? The community health workers are really helping people navigate. I mean, this is what they are. They're navigators, the healthcare system. But when it comes to, I mean, that's great for, everyday, regular checkups, these kinds of things. People are interacting in that way. But when it comes to having a chronic illness or something like Nati, where she was trying to get her cochlear implants, or she was needing to get therapy services, particularly to help her in school and to kind of help her keep developing, you know, that's when it gets harder, right? That's when the resources are much harder. And when you are, if you're uninsured and you are a citizen or a resident, then you can at least access other, or your children can access other programs like CHIP or Medicaid, these kinds of things. In Texas, particularly, I say children because in Texas, this is one of the things that the Affordable Care Act did, or that, you know, the way that it took place in kind of giving states the autonomy to kind of decide what aspects of it to integrate. So Texas didn't expand Medicaid, California did expand Medicaid, and so you have a really different experience of how undocumented immigrants, what undocumented immigrants can access in California, or what uninsured people can access in California versus what people can access in Texas, even just uninsured people who are documented. And it's really bad, and it's really, what it's caused is for us to have more uninsured folks. So Texas is one of the most uninsured states in the nation. And so our public hospitals, which we only have 2, are just, they're completely under-resourced and, you know, overwhelmed. And this is what people are using when they have to deal with more chronic things. And a lot of times when they go to these hospitals, they're just kind of being kept alive, right? So if you go and you're dying, or, you know, with something that is chronic, you know, the hospital, all they have to really do is kind of patch you up and then send you away, and then they kind of, so they're coming back all the time, right? And there's a colleague of mine, actually, who I interviewed for the work. He's also a physician at Baylor and was teaching in the Honors College at UH, Ricardo Nuila, who just wrote, actually just published a book called The People's Hospital, and he writes about, you know, kind of what it feels like to be a physician in that situation, where you know that you're sending them home either usually just to come back, right, or to die. And you know, the kind of the responsibility of that, and how that has happened in terms of policy-wise. So it's really contradictory, you know, because you are, you know, it burdens the system. And that's where the things like, you know, when we start talking about policy, you know, that's where it gets really frustrating and overwhelming a lot of times, and where people start to believe that nothing can happen. There's nothing to do, that we can't change anything, you know. And I think that, you know, one of the things that I try to do in my work is very much about what I call living barriers, right? And so yes, there's the policy, yes, there's the structural barriers. At the same time, those policies and barriers are written and enacted and incorporated by people, right? And when people are going to the doctor, they're interacting with individuals. And a lot of times, that labor, that struggle, anyone who has interacted with public health systems knows how exhausting it can be, even more so. I mean, even interacting with private doctors and your insurance is exhausting. But adding to that the layer of a public system that's already overwhelmed and overburdened, and where people are not always patient and able to respond because they're overworked, right, also. And you don't have transportation, and you don't have, you know, all of these kinds, you don't have childcare, all of those types of things make it really difficult. And so I talk about that emotional labor and the ways in which individuals that are strategically planted in those spaces can alleviate that and really make a difference despite the policy, right? The way that people are making a difference in some of these spaces despite some of these really restrictive policies, particularly community health workers. So I have an article on that because I do think that they're doing some really incredible work in Houston particularly, and really unappreciated, you know, in the ways that they are kind of filling in those gaps that we have in our system out there. Thank you for that question. Mm-hmm.
Thank you for coming. My name's Jasmine. I'm a senior here at CMC. I was wondering, one of the challenges I faced during my thesis and writing it is when trying to integrate testimonials, I worry a lot about erasure. Mm-hmm. Erasure about certain parts of that person's story. So mm-hmm. I was wondering how you balanced in your book telling Claudia's multi-layered story mm-hmm. Without cutting aspects out of her life.
Yes, yes. It was really hard. I agonized over it a lot. There's certainly, hours and hours of recorded interviews that never made it into the book. And, it was just impossible to get all of that narrative in there. And, it really just took kind of going through the different stories. So when I interviewed her, first of all, I had different topics that that I kind of prepared her for. So I came in and I said, okay, today we're going to talk, or this week we're going to talk about Nati, and we're going to talk about her experience, with the doctors specifically, or we're going to talk about your immigration story. And then I had to prepare her for, we're going to talk about your health, your life, whatever you want to talk about, because that wasn't something she really wanted to talk about very much. So I had to prepare her for that. So in that sense, I kind of had it organized a little bit in terms of what I wanted structurally to write about. And I think that's important because sometimes we get into the field, and especially when it's a story or something that we're very passionate about, and it's something that, it's with a very sort of candid individual who, is going to speak about, they're just going to talk. So you kind of have to have a way to kind of keep yourself like a little bit of a roadmap, It's not always possible to stick to your plan when you're interviewing people. Sometimes, like I said in the beginning, I started my project doing one thing and then it kind of transformed into something else. And it's good to kind of allow for that, not to try to force anything because that's your agenda and that's what you want to do, right? If the person is guiding you in a different direction and you can't redirect, then it's okay to flow and then figure it out, right? That's kind of your job as the researcher, right? To kind of, what does this mean? Where are the connections? And so because I had been writing about it already, I had already published several articles, I had already gotten certain things out of my system, so I already knew kind of what I wanted to focus on here. And then it just became a matter of kind of how it felt as I was writing it. What was coming out as most important, what had more body to it in terms of the story that she was telling me, and there were also the interweaving of my mother's narrative. It isn't balanced, right? And so I wanted the book. One thing I agonized a lot over was how to integrate these narratives without decentering Claudia's story. I wanted to make sure that she still stayed as the main focus and that I didn't decenter her story. And so the parts of her story that I felt really strongly connected to my mother's story, then I write about that, and then there were parts that didn't connect because they weren't the same. My mother wasn't undocumented. My mother wasn't having to deal with that kind of medical exclusion. And so that was different. So there's chapters where there isn't a lot of my mom's story, and it's just Claudia. And so, I think the books take a long time to write because it takes more time to actually digest it, right? To actually kind of come back and think about it and reflect on it. It doesn't happen overnight. And I think that's why books take years, and then so much life happens and so many things happen that kind of redirect you. Right, and I think you have to allow for that thinking time, and a lot of times when it comes to the academic world, whether you're a student or a full-blown professor scholar, there isn't always time. That time isn't always allotted to be able to slowly, reflect upon the material. But I think it is important to take it, and then where you can't put everything, to say, if you feel like you needed to say, this was left out because of time constraints, and then potentially write another book about it or do something else with it. It's interesting because there is stuff that's now coming out as I talk about the book and present the book that I wasn't able to put in the book. So the stories, other aspects of the stories come out anyway, right? Because people want to know, or people ask questions that relate to those interactions. One thing I say in the book is not everything has to be written and published, and I think that there is very much also an art to what gets left out, the intentionality of leaving things out. And I say that, there are things that I intentionally leave out. You know why? Because everything doesn't have to be known, and it's okay, right? And some of it is things that Claudia asks me to leave out, and some of it is things that, you know, I think it doesn't, people don't need to know that. I mean, that's okay, that could be an intimate conversation that we had, you know? And I think that that has to do with your own ethic, but it also has to do with, there's also a lot of intentionality in terms of what you're trying to do with that work. What is the purpose of that work? And ultimately, if you know the purpose of that work, what community is that work geared toward? Who are you speaking to? Who is your reader? Then you can very easily make those decisions because you know what you're doing with it.
Thank you.
Yes, you're welcome.
Hi, my name is Carlos. I'm a sophomore here at Claremont McKenna. First of all, thank you for coming and speaking with us tonight. Secondly, I feel like I related a lot with everything you spoke on tonight, both your experiences living with your grandmother at a very critical age, Claudia and Nati's relationship, and those decisions Claudia has to make as a undocumented mother. Mm-hmm. And so hearing about all of this, I think I'm more motivated to broach those sort of topics with my own mom and begin to see her as, I guess, a woman and a person in general. So I was wondering if you have any advice as to how to begin that process. She quite literally just called me. I told her I'll call you back in 20 because I need to figure this out first.
First of all, call her back. Call your mom back. That's fantastic. And thank you for sharing that with me. That's one of the best things I think that has come out of this work are the youth that have shared with me that they are going and sharing this book with their mothers and having these conversations with their mothers. I mean, that's something that I didn't foresee. And I think it's incredible and it's so important. We're talking so much about generational trauma right now in this historical moment, and a lot of it can be very isolating, right? And this idea that you have to kind of just separate from, within Latinx families, that doesn't always work, that the connections are so unique, right? That it's you can't just cut people off, and I don't necessarily think that that's always necessary, maybe in some cases. But when it comes to, these kinds of generational immigrant stories, I think it is important that we go back and talk to our mothers and find out what it was like for them, what were you feeling, what were you thinking? I guess the only advice I will have, or the only thing I will say is that it's gonna be awkward. It was very awkward for me. I could sit there and talk to Claudia for hours, and as soon as I sat down in front of my mother, I felt so awkward and so uncomfortable, mostly because my mom first of all, she hates talking in general about herself. She's very quiet, she's very reserved. She doesn't like to be the focus of attention, and she doesn't like to talk about emotions. She's just, oh my gosh, it was it was very hard for her. And so she gets really nervous, and then she starts crying because she's nervous. And so then she would make me nervous, and then I would feel bad, and so it was just really hard. And I think that it's gonna bring out a lot of stuff in you. It's gonna require patience. I didn't force her to tell me anything that she didn't want to. I would try to kind of gently ask her, especially when she would get emotional. I would say, "Do you want to tell me why you're getting emotional? What are you thinking?" Or I would just give her the space, if she just needed to cry, just give her the space to cry. Yeah. It's really great that you're gonna do that, and I wish you the best. Really, for both of you. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you all for your amazing questions, and thank you again to our speaker for her wonderful talk. I hope you all have a really great evening, and I hope to see you all again soon.